How did the ancient Israelites come to worship a single God? And why was that God worshipped in the city of Jerusalem? The life of a particular child king may hold the answer: King Josiah. The biblical authors remember Josiah as the leader of a massive religious reform that changed the course of Judah's history and led to a new dominant form of monotheistic religion centralized in Jerusalem. According to 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, Josiah came to the throne at the age of 8 after 2 generations of evil and apostasy. Hezekiah's son, Manasseh, rebuilt cultic sites to gods other than Yahweh, even building additional altars in the Jerusalem temple for sacrifices to other gods. King Amon, Josiah's father, continued this practice. But Josiah brought this to an end. The biblical authors portray Josiah as a devout worshiper of Israel's God, Yahweh, and one who exemplified the most noble characteristics of King David. But, unlike King David, Josiah ruled during a time when a temple for Yahweh stood in Jerusalem. The temple, just like any other royal building project, required periodic renovation. So, while inventorying the temple's treasury, the high priest found a book that 2 Kings calls the Book of the Law. Scholars have long assumed that this was an early form of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. When the king's chief advisor read the book aloud to Josiah, the king tore his garments in grief. Josiah was convinced that Judah had strayed from the laws of Yahweh and had kindled his wrath against the kingdom. Josiah then assembled the people at the temple, where he read aloud to them the book of the law and made a covenant with Yahweh to uphold his commandments. The words of this covenant echo the language of Deuteronomy, in which Israel is counseled by Moses to love Yahweh with all their hearts, souls, and strength. Josiah then launched a major religious reformation, starting with the temple itself. He commanded the high priest to remove all non-Yahwistic elements from the temple. Items devoted to the gods Baal and Asherah were brought out and burned, and he deposed any priest who offered sacrifices to gods and anyone else who had participated in illicit worship. Beyond the city of Jerusalem, the Bible says that Josiah destroyed cultic sites in Bethel, Samaria, and other parts of the land, while commanding that apostate priests be executed on the spot. In both accounts, the process of purging the land concludes with Josiah's return to Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant was reinstalled in its rightful location within the temple, and Josiah decreed that all the people would keep the Passover festival. Although Josiah's ancestor Hezekiah is said to have led religious reforms as well, the Bible describes Josiah's campaign to reorient the people of Judah to Yahweh as both grander in scale and deeper in impact. But to what extent do we see the reforms in the archaeological record? Well, most scholars accept the idea that Josiah enacted some kind of religious reform, but the archaeological record remains silent on most of the particulars. Let's start with all of those cultic sites outside of Jerusalem. The Bible says that Josiah destroyed illicit worship sites throughout the lands of Judah and Israel, specifically mentioning Beersheba, Bethel, and Samaria as locations where Josiah dismantled altars, executed priests, and burned cultic paraphernalia. While we don't see evidence of this purge in the archaeological record, it's clear that the religious lives of most people in ancient Israel and Judah were not centered around the Jerusalem temple. Before Josiah took the throne, there were major cultic sites throughout the land. These sites consisted of open-air sanctuaries, altars, and standing stones called masebot, which were often situated in high places. These stones may have represented several individual gods, which, in the eyes of Josiah, would be a form of idolatry and polytheism. Tel Dan was home to one of the most important cultic sites dating to the Iron Age, which consisted of an open-air shrine with a four-horned altar, as well as a separate open-air section for standing stones next to the city gate. There's also some evidence from Beersheba of religious activity too, but these sites do not provide direct evidence of Josiah's reforms. Tel Dan was not part of Josiah's kingdom, and the evidence from Beersheba does not appear to line up with the time frame when Josiah ruled. But these sites do demonstrate that Israelite religion, for much of its history, was not only decentralized, but could also include the worship of multiple gods. The people apparently worshipped Yahweh along with other gods like El, Baal, and Asherah for centuries. This complex religious history makes drawing the lines of an official Israelite religion pretty difficult. Prior to the 20th century, one of the main assumptions of biblical scholars was that the Canaanites and Israelites were distinct peoples, both ethnically and culturally. Israelite religion was therefore portrayed as unique from Canaanite religious practice. But archaeological excavations over the last century continue to produce evidence showing that such distinctions are not so clear-cut. Household worship throughout the region apparently incorporated representations of other gods and established local sites for cult practice. As mentioned in previous episodes, assemblages of human and animal figurines, such as Judean pillar figurines, have been found at Iron Age sites throughout Israel and Judah. This evidence shows us that the cultic practice of the Israelite people clearly did not match up with Josiah's ideals, which might have been part of the motivation for his sweeping reforms. The reforms Josiah and the small group of elites in Jerusalem who supported him would have thus been quite shocking to the majority of the population, because both the archaeological record and the biblical texts depict a significant amount of religious diversity in Israel and Judah. Although Deuteronomy and Kings consistently claim that Israel brought their Yahweh-only religion with them upon entering the land, the Merneptah Stele implicitly suggests that Israel's religious allegiance was not initially to Yahweh alone, nor even to Yahweh at all, but to the Canaanite god El, a reality visible in the name itself, Israel. But even Yahweh-exclusive religion should not be called monotheism. Ancient Israelite religion, based on evidence found both in the Hebrew Bible as well in the archaeological record, can better be defined as monolatrous. Monolatry means the recognition of the existence of many gods, but with the consistent worship of only one God. When we read verses like Micah 4:5, "For all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God," we should take the prophet at his word. They believed that many gods exist, but Israel worships Yahweh exclusively. Strict monotheism, if it ever truly existed as the status quo, was a later development. Scholars have argued we don't see clear denial of the existence of other gods until quite late in the Hebrew Bible, maybe around the 6th century BCE in sections of the book of Isaiah. Remains from two sites located on the edge of the Judean wilderness, Arad and Ein Hatzavah, might provide limited insight into religious reforms in the Kingdom of Judah. Tel Arad is a fort located on the southern frontier of the Kingdom of Judah, on the fringe of the Negev desert. Inside the fort, archaeologists discovered a religious sanctuary, sometimes described as a shrine or a temple. It had an outer courtyard with an altar, as well as an inner Holy of Holies, where archaeologists discovered a standing stone and two limestone altars, one taller than the other. Some reconstruct that the sanctuary originally had two standing stones. Now, remember that standing stones may be a non-anthropomorphic way to represent a god, so some scholars have interpreted this as an expression of Judahite religion involving Yahweh and a consort goddess, which, referring back to the previous discussion, demonstrates the monolatrous nature of ancient Israelite religion. Residue analysis of the larger altar revealed traces of frankincense, while the smaller altar revealed traces of cannabis, which, according to the researchers of the study, may be the first known evidence of a hallucinogenic substance found in the Kingdom of Judah. So what does this site have to do with religious reforms? Well, there's some evidence that someone intentionally dismantled the Tel Arad sanctuary. The incense altars and the standing stone were discovered placed on their sides and covered with dirt and plaster. Some of the walls were dismantled, and the whole area and the altar and the courtyard were covered by 3 meters of dirt. However, it's unlikely that these activities can be attributed to King Josiah. The whole sanctuary apparently was dismantled in the 8th century, well before Josiah's reign. Some archaeologists thus suggest that this might be evidence for religious reforms under King Hezekiah instead. Further southeast at Ein Hatzavah, archaeologists have uncovered an assemblage of smashed cultic pottery vessels that appear to have been intentionally shattered. But overall, evidence to demonstrate that these items were destroyed at the command of King Josiah is lacking. What is known is that Judean royal seals changed in the 7th century, following the period of Josiah's rule. In the preceding era, these markers of royal property and official correspondence bore images and symbols associated with the types of cultic practice that Josiah sought to destroy. By the late 7th century, the majority of seals lacked such iconography, which might indicate that Josiah's reforms succeeded on some level. Josiah is remembered by the biblical authors as a king who had no parallel, either before or after his reign. Josiah's intentions for religious reforms aligned with the hopes of the biblical authors that scholars today call Deuteronomists, a group who sought to limit local religious differences and encourage a centralized form of Yahwism based in Jerusalem. With such acts of centralization, the theologies and cultic practice outside of Jerusalem were subsumed by a more dominant royal theology and religious practice. Through the cross-examination of textual and archaeological evidence, we can see that biblical texts by and large enunciate a specifically Judahite Yahwism that matured right before, during, and after the Babylonian exile. But despite going down in history as one of the greatest kings of Judah, he met an untimely death. The young Josiah inherited a kingdom during a period of Neo-Assyrian decline. A century before, the Assyrian Empire destroyed Judah's northern neighbor, Israel, and later destroyed many of Judah's fortified cities under King Hezekiah. While Judah regained some level of economic and political stability after this, during Josiah's reign, Judah found itself in the familiar position of being sandwiched between warring superpowers. In 609 BCE, the Egyptians and Assyrians engaged in battle together against the advancing Babylonian armies north of Judah. Although much remains unknown about this fight, it appears that the Assyrians were trying to protect their western territories. The biblical sources indicate that Josiah rode north from Judah and that upon meeting the Pharaoh at Megiddo, he was killed. But the Bible details the last moments of Josiah's life and indicates that his body was returned to Jerusalem for burial. Josiah's untimely demise resonates in some ways with his unexpected rise to power at such a young age, and likely contributed to the memory of this child king as a great reformer and proponent of Yahwism. But despite Josiah's reforms, less than a century after these events, Jerusalem would fall to the Babylonian armies of Nebuchadnezzar, the punishment for the people for their apostasy. Stay tuned for the next episode, The Fall of Jerusalem.